In this video, we'll explore the fresh packaging of Talens Designer Gouache. We'll take a look at all of the colors, discuss color mixing properties, and then I'll share some techniques with you on how I like to use this paint in my own work. Let's kick things off by introducing you to the new packaging. Today we're focusing on two sets. Here's a look at the 10-piece tube set. The tubes have been rebranded with fresh packaging but contain the same formula of professional-grade gouache within. Now on the other hand, we have the 6-piece glass jar set. These jars offer a completely new painting experience. Talens up to this point has only ever offered their gouache in tubes. So if you're familiar with jelly gouache sets, then you'll love the convenience of these jars. However, these come with a lid to keep your paints nice and fresh. Here's a quick look of what the other sets used to look like. Again, they are both the same formula, just new packaging for the new sets. Here's a look at the packaging on display at an art convention I demoed at last month. Now let's set up the journal for doing some color swatching. I'm taping off larger areas for these swatches because this gouache in particular really likes to be thinned down with water, so I want to show you what it looks like at its thickest point and also what it's going to look like when it's the most thinned down. I'm also going to use a micron, which is waterproof, to create a black line across the top of my swatches because I want to show you guys how opaque this paint can be. This is the larger set of 10 tubes, which contain 20 milliliters of paint inside. First up, we have number 100 in both the tube and the exact same color in the jar. This white contains two different pigments, PW6 and PW5, which is a mixture of titanium white and also lithenpone. You can see how easily it covers over that black line at the top. Next up is yellow, which is number 200. It contains PY74, which is aerolide yellow, and PO67. You'll see that this is a very solid primary yellow, which is going to be great for color mixing. You'll notice that most of the colors in this set have a rating of 3 on the light fast scale, which means that those are going to be at least 100 years light fast under museum conditions. I'll let you know when we get to a color that has a lower light fast rating. Here's yellow ochre, known as number 227, and the pigment inside, this is just a single pigmented paint, is PY42, also known as yellow iron oxide. Typically yellow ochres are quite opaque in nature, so I used a lot of water down towards the bottom to try to get it a little bit more transparent. This yellow ochre seems like it definitely has a little bit more texture than the yellow we just used before this. Here's vermilion, number 311, and this is another single pigmented paint, which contains the pigment PR255. And sometimes I get questions about why it really matters what pigments are in what colors, and it matters for a couple reasons. Essentially, the first one being the quality of the pigments is going to directly impact the intensity and the vibrancy of the colors. But secondly, it's important to know what pigments are inside, what colors you're using, so that in the future, as you begin to develop favorite colors and colors you like to work with, you know exactly what to look for. And also, some pigments are toxic, and some people like to avoid those pigments. So I think it just generally is a good idea to know more about your paint rather than less. Next up is carmine, and this is one of the pigments I was telling you about that is a little bit more fugitive. Its light fast rating is only 1, which means that it only has a 10 to 25 year light fast under museum conditions rating. And that essentially means that it's going to fade over time. So if you're just using your artwork for scanning purposes, then this color will be fine, but you may want to reconsider using it if you're creating a commissioned piece or something you plan on selling. This one is a double pigmented color containing PR112 and PR23. And I'm so glad that they included burnt sienna in this set. This is a very popular color that I find myself reaching for quite a bit. It's number 411 in the Talens line, and it is also a single pigmented color containing PR 101. I sped this part up for you guys to show you how thick this paint normally goes on, and then after I just add a little bit of water into my brush, you'll see how quicker it can spread and how it also thins it down and makes it a little bit more transparent towards the bottom of the swatch. Now we have Ultramarine Deep, which is number 506, and it contains PB29. As ultramarine sometimes does, this color does granulate just a little bit, and it's the only color within both of the sets that I found that does that. When using it in its thicker format, you're not going to get any granulation, but once you add a little bit of water and start using it on a heavier texture paper, you may see a little bit of granulation in those thinner areas. This is Prussian Blue Phthalo, and it contains PB15. Also, if you're interested in learning more about artist pigments, not only for watercolors, gouache, but oils and acrylics and pastels, literally everything, I'm going to link a website down below in the description that's free to use, and it's an entire database of all of the different pigments. So it's worth taking a look at and just seeing what's out there. I know I've definitely learned a thing or two by just browsing this website. Next up is Viridian with PG7 as its only pigment. For this 10 tube set, they've included 2 yellows, 2 reds, and 2 blues for us. So we know we're going to be able to mix a ton of different colors off of those double set of 3 primaries. It's nice that they added this Viridian in as the secondary color, as well as a convenience brown, burnt sienna, and of course the black. And this is Intense Black as the last color, or as they like to call it, Black Intenso, which I find amusing. And it's PBK 9. I swatched this black last because right next to it on the other page I'm going to swatch the other black from the other set, and I thought it would be helpful to be able to compare the two right next to each other. What's so interesting about both of these blacks is that they're both single pigmented and they use the exact same pigment. And this gouache does not have any additives in it because of that traditional dextrin binder. So it must be purely how those pigments are processed to make the two different blacks. Awesome, so now let's talk a little bit about the color mixing 6 set with the jars. There are 15 milliliters of paint inside each of the jars, so a little bit less than the tube. And we're going to start off with neutral black. When painting with the jars, you can either dip your brush directly into the jar if you want to use it in its thickest, most viscous state. But if you're planning on adding water or mixing them with other colors, you're probably going to need a palette off to the side. While both of these blacks were wet or partially wet, it was very hard to tell the two colors apart from each other. They looked basically the same, minus the fact that the neutral black spread a little bit more evenly, but we'll have to wait till they're fully dry to see any subtle differences between the two. This is Lemon Yellow, and this one is given a 2-star rating on the Lightfast scale, which means that it's 25 to 100 years Lightfast. This one was, it seemed to me, a little bit less opaque than the other colors, but it had that beautiful, almost luminous lemon coloring to it. It's single pigmented with PY3 as the only color in the jar. The Permanent Rose is much more Lightfast than the Carmine in the other set, and it has 2 pigments, PV19 and PR122. So we have a violet pigment and also a red pigment in this color, which you can see because it's a true magenta. So for this color mixing 6-jar set, think of it almost like a printer, where it's CMYK, cyan, yellow, magenta, black. CMYK is typically used for printed designs like t-shirts, flyers, business cards, etc. The other set is much closer to a RGB color mixing, which is red, green, blue, and that's mostly known for digital designs like web or TV. Now we have light blue, which is PB15, And I just wanted to make one more note about the CMYK quality of the gouache. That's why it's so popular among designers and why it's been so popular for so long is back in the day when we used to do everything traditionally instead of on computers, designers would use gouache because it has a matte finish to it, so it's very easy to photograph or scan and replicate for print. Last up, we have deep green. Deep green consists of PY3 and also PG7. In my opinion, we don't really need a green in this set. It's mainly just a convenience color because, of course, we can easily mix a green based off the yellow and blue in here, but it is a really nice way to make muddy colors faster. We're going to let this color chart dry up really well before we remove the tape, and once we do so, you'll be able to see the beautiful matte sheen over the paints, which is one of gouache's special properties, is that it's going to dry completely matte, and you're not really going to be able to see any strokes in it unless if you're using lots of water to thin it down. Then it will look a little bit more like a watercolor where you can intentionally have strokes in the more thinned down areas. Here's a look at the traditional 10 color tube set. And as you can see, this is going to be really conducive for painting portraits. You could do landscapes. You could really do anything with this set. It would just have a little bit more of a natural color palette. And then the color mixing set has that more high chroma look. This is perfect for artists that like the more vibrant palette or don't mind mixing to achieve certain colors. Here's a close-up of the two blacks. As you can see, the one on the left has a little bit of a cooler hue, and it also seems like it held its brush strokes a little bit more than the one on the right. You'll be able to see the texture of the watercolor paper where the gouache is thinned down, and then where it's thicker, that's where you can really see that matte quality of the paint coming through. We have minimal reflection off the thicker parts of the paint. Now that we have a pretty good understanding about how the colors look swatched, let's mix them and see what colors we can truly make out of our color mixing set. On the left, I have a standard 6 wheel, and that will allow us just to basically mix our primary red, yellow, blue, and our secondary orange, green, violet. And then on the right, we have a 12 wheel where we'll be able to mix the interim colors between the secondary and primary colors as well. So as you can see, we have a pretty full range of colors between them. At the bottom here, I'm making a little bit of mud to see how close I can get to a gray. And then I'm adding white and black to it on each end just to see what the full grayscale would be. Because gouache is reworkable, I'm adding a little bit of white in the center of the color wheel on the left. And you'll see that the green on the color wheel is actually pretty similar to the green offered within the set as well. In order to make muddier colors, we're going to mix complementary colors, and I'll talk a little bit later on about that during one of the paintings that I'll be showing you. I also wanted to show you how the red, yellow, and blue, which are the traditional primary colors, look mixed as opposed to the cyan, yellow, magenta. So I'm going to be using the 12 color wheel for both of these just so that you can see the larger range. I really did not understand color mixing until I started playing around with gouache and figuring out how they work with each other. Color wheels are wonderful learning tools, but not necessarily the only way to learn about color mixing. But if you start with a color wheel and you use those skills to mix your own colors with limited palettes in your own artwork, you'll learn a lot about what to look for in references and also how to mix certain colors as opposed to just buying them. The last color wheel that I want to show off is the Zorn palette, and that's traditionally going to be cadmium red, yellow ochre, ivory black, and flake white. We have most of the pigments of those colors in this set, so I'm just going to show off what that would look like. Traditionally, the Zorn palette is known for mixing skin tones, and that's because it's known for its subtlety. You have the warm colors, which are the red and the yellow, and you have the cool colors, which is the white and the black, which kind of acts as a blue because the ivory black has a very cool undertone. So you're able to mix a lot of very subtle colors out of this very limited palette. Just another tip, while mixing this gouache, I like to have it on a separate palette. If I'm mixing a larger batch, I'll use a palette knife. This paint really does need to be mixed with water because of the binder and the sticky nature of this gouache in particular. So be sure to thoroughly mix it and use enough water to thin it down so it spreads evenly. Not only will it be easier to use, but your color mixes will be more concise and more thoroughly mixed so that you'll get less unevenness in your paint. As you can see, all of these color wheels have such a different feeling to them, so I think you can do a lot with either palette. You can use a variety of different surfaces for gouache, but today I'm going to use aquabord for my paintings. Aquabord is nice because it really allows you to pick up colors, and gouache is great at layering, and these panels will accept so many layers. I also just enjoy the texture of these panels. They have an absorbent clay-based ground on top, and I think that the matte quality of the gouache just looks so nice on the panel. Once your gouache paintings are finished, you can either put them behind glass in a frame, or you can spray them with a varnish, preferably one that has UVLS in it. Just be hyper aware of what colors are light fast and if they may or may not fade over time. One tip I have for painting on panels is using a little piece of masking tape on the back. You can secure the panel in place and not have to worry about movement just by simply taping it down to the desk. For both of these small paintings, I'm going to be using the 6 set of gouache. This way I can give you a couple color mixing tips and also talk about using it out of the jar. The tubes are pretty self-explanatory and the jars are like a whole new color experience. So let me tell you a couple things about what I learned when I was using them. You can unscrew all the lids and dip your brush directly in there, but I suggest using a palette knife to remove the paint from the jar into the palette. And this is because that paint is going to have a very sticky kind of viscosity until you mix in that water. By moving the paint over from the jars to a clean palette, I'm also ensuring that my colors do not get contaminated within the jar. You may also see a little bit of binder separation, which is natural, but you'll need to stir it really well to make sure that the pigment and the binder adhere. Because I live in a very dry climate, I find it helpful to use a water mister to mist the gouache every so often. Especially when you're doing a lot of color mixing, it's very helpful to have two jars. This paint is very thick, so having one jar to clean off the brush and then the other jar to make sure your brush is nice and clean for color mixing is a great way to go. As you can see, we are mixing muddy colors for the skin tone, and I'm using very wet, very thin layers. And in order to get these gouache opaque colors thin, you really have to use a lot of water. And if you do plan on doing a lot of layers on your gouache painting, make sure to keep them thin, because if you paint too thickly with gouache, it will crack on your painting. The same goes for keeping gouache in a palette like this. It'll probably crack and crumble. You can reconstitute it with water, but it won't be the same as watercolor. Some people keep gouache in airtight palettes, however, you do need to keep in mind that mold may form, and that's just because of the wet nature of the paint. One way around this is to paint with distilled water or to spray isopropyl alcohol occasionally in your palette. I digress. Let's go back to color mixing. In order to create mud, you are just essentially going to use complementary colors, which is a color across from the other color on a color wheel. So, for example, a complementary color of red would be green. And if you mix red and green together, you get a muddy color, which is typically brown, depending on the red and green. You can either mix them together in your palette, or you can layer them on your painting to optically mix them. When layering, you do have to be cognizant of how dry the layer beneath your gouache is, because if the layer you're freshly painting on top is on top of a layer that is slightly wet, then you will mix the two layers together as opposed to layering a new glaze on top. So especially when working with this gouache, I have to keep an eye on how dry it actually is. I think that the color harmony in this painting is very strong. It looks like I didn't paint this from 5 different reference photos because the lighting is so consistent and everything is so harmonious. And I achieved that because most of my colors are single pigmented, so I got really clean color mixes and I used all of the colors throughout the painting. So I hope that this time lapse was helpful for you to see kind of how the painting comes together. It's kind of like an acrylic painting where you have to slowly build it up for it to make sense. And this is just my process overall. But in the next part of the video, I'm going to be showing you real-time techniques on using gouache with different brushes and just different techniques that I used to create this piece, essentially. Gouache is very versatile and there's many different ways to use it. So hopefully between these two paintings, you'll kind of get an idea of some different ways that you could use gouache. I normally start out by using a mop brush, and this will allow the brush to hold a lot of water as well as pigment. And as you can see here, I can quickly fill in an area that looks pretty transparent using the mop. When painting on aquabord, you will get a little bit of discoloration as that actual water is drying, but as you can see, it kind of self-levels a little bit because of that binder. When using a different type of more snappy synthetic brush, I'm able to use that thicker paint to lay down the areas that I know I'm not really going to glaze over, especially the background. For these areas, I won't mix in near as much water, and you'll see I get a really nice clean line. But when I add extra water to the paint, or just use a wet brush, I'm able to disturb an area and blend it out a little bit. The key to clean dragging of the paint is to make sure that you keep wiping off your brush and cleaning it with water in between holes. If you know that you're going to be doing a lot of layering on an area, start pretty light by mixing water into your paint on your palette. This way you can slowly control and build up how dark the area will be, and you'll be able to glaze or layer color over top. Because gouache is pretty opaque, you need to keep an eye on how opaque it's actually going to be if you want some of those lower layers to follow through. When working on areas that are very high chroma, I like to just plug in the darkest areas of color in that spot with a bigger brush using a thicker mixture of paint. And then I'll follow through with typically a round that just has water in the bristles. The more you scrub over an area, the more you'll diffuse that edge. If you like the edge that's there, you can just lightly glaze over with a little bit of water to distribute the color. One of the hardest things to master is the amount of water that you have on your brush. And once you figure out that, you'll be able to do a lot with just a little bit of paint. If working with a very limited palette, it's helpful to follow through with a specific color you've mixed and plug it in wherever you may see it in the painting. This way, not only are you cutting down on paint waste, but you're providing continuity throughout your painting by making sure that you're using the same color wherever it needs to be placed. For doing a flat wash with gouache, all you need is a large brush and a little bit of water. Place down one layer and let it dry fully. Those brush strokes will disappear over time. With gouache, your brush shape matters a lot. I like to use a larger flat brush to glaze, and I'll use something snappy. And then in order to blend out the edge, I'll just use a damp mop brush. And you can see how it adds a really soft kind of blended edge on there. So I'll just use a little bit of water and be sure to dry off my brush in between strokes. Because I don't want to just push the color around, I'm actually lifting it up on the edge and spreading it with that mop. That's also why I like to use an angled wash brush. because then that way I can kind of turn the brush to get in smaller areas or turn it to get in larger areas and do that flat wash. But just remember, you plug in the color and then follow through with the mop to diffuse the edge. You can also do this for thinner little detail areas. You can use the side of the brush or you could use a round brush. Speaking of brushes, you really can use any type of watercolor or acrylic brush with gouache. I like to use something that has a little bit more snap to it so that it has a nice crisp line to it. And then if I want that softer edge, I can intentionally switch over to another brush. Just be careful if you're using something like a squirrel brush because it can hold a lot of water and make it more challenging. You'll see here I'm starting to build up the reflection, and I've just added a little bit of white onto my brush, and I'm brushing it over that lightly wet red to mix on the actual painting to get the more opaque reflections towards the bottom of the glasses. I want to make these glasses look transparent, so it's important to me to leave the lighter wash towards the top for now until I continue to refine the skin. You'll see that the shirt has dried almost a completely flat wash, and I'm able to add a really bold pattern on top of it by just using a little bit of water in my paint, but keeping that paint mostly thick. The gouache dries pretty quickly, but once it is completely dry, I'm able to add my next layer on top. I only want to make sure it's fully dry if I'm concerned about the layer above it having crisp edges or if I'm doing a glazing technique on top. A tip for crisp lines is to make sure you have the right water to paint mixture in your brush. If you have the right ratio, the lines should be crisp and smooth. If it has a dry edge at all, you need more water in your brush. Another type of brush I like to use is a dry brush, or also known as a scrubber brush. It typically is a natural hair brush. I find that filberts are the easiest to use in my style and preferred way of painting for me, just because you get a little bit of a more soft edge. But you can actually lift up through multiple layers of gouache by just adding a little bit of water onto this brush and lightly scrubbing. This will help you take back an area if you need to redo it or you've made a mistake, or it will help you lift up that color a few layers, just aesthetically if you want that area to have more of a highlight to it. Filberts in general are great for blending or creating soft edges around natural objects. So I use them a lot for portraits, and they're also great for adding details or lines if you want to use the side of them instead. And as I mentioned earlier, I generally like to paint transparent to opaque. You don't have to do that with gouache, you can just start out fully opaque and nice and thick. And alternatively, you can paint transparent basically the entire painting if you'd like. Especially for the last few layers on my gouache paintings, I normally am still doing glazes because I like to bring my painting up all together at the same time, and sometimes I don't know how heavy of a shadow it actually needs until I'm closer to the end of the painting than the beginning. I want to talk a little bit about what makes gouache different than watercolor, because every time I paint with gouache, I have a lot of people ask me that, especially because it can be used so similarly and it has many properties that watercolor has. The main difference is that it's going to be more opaque, and typically that's because gouache has larger pigments than watercolor does. It's milled less, or it has an additive in it, a mattifying additive that will make it matte and a little bit thicker. For this gouache in particular, it has a binder called dextrin. That binder is a potato starch, and it's used in archival adhesives, paper making, all sorts of different things, which is just an ode to how archival it can be. But because of that dextrin binder, you're going to get a little bit of a different painting experience with this gouache than others. This gouache, in my experience, is a lot more sticky, and if you don't mix water with it, it's not going to feel like a gouache. It'll feel like a totally different animal. So be sure when you're using this gouache to use plenty of water and either mix it on your palette or mix it on your painting but the more water you have, the smoother of an experience you're going to have. That dextrin binder is going to give it the thixotropic quality, where that paint kind of levels out by itself over time if you don't agitate it. So that's what makes glazing and layering with this so dreamy, is that you're going to have that really thick paint experience. If you want it to be like other gouaches, you can just add extra water, or you could even add in a watercolor medium that thins down the paint a little bit. I also wanted to mention something called color shift. While working with gouache, typically dark colors will lighten up substantially after drying, and meanwhile, light colors will also darken. So, in order to get those deeper shadows, typically you may need to go a little darker than you think you might. So, right now her neck is wet, and here it is dry. Did you see that big shift in color? How deep and rich it once was, and how now it kind of desaturated a little bit and lightened up? That's just something to keep in mind while mixing your colors, that you may need to wait for some areas to dry a little bit before deciding what color you even want to plug in for the next step. Generally, I think that's the hardest part about using gouache, is just anticipating what color it's actually going to turn out to be, but after using it a couple times, you'll definitely get the hang of it. There's a lot of people that say that gouache is one of the more forgiving mediums, and I believe that because you're able to layer, you can re-wet an area if you need to and work back into it, and you can always glaze transparent layers. So there's a lot of different ways to use it, and no matter how you end up using it, it's always going to have that beautiful matte finish, and man, I just really like gouache. Alright guys, that's a wrap. I hope you enjoy this exploration of the Talens Designer Gouache as much as I did. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I really hope that you picked up a tip or two along the way. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next time.